thing into a button group. So let's look at that. Foundation, documentation, under buttons. You see button group listed on the left side there. Button group class to a container, plays inside of any number of buttons. That seems simple enough. So back in index, we have these buttons, fave and remove. So we have the class actions on there already. Let's just add the class button group. And you see they're kind of joined together. That immediately raised the question of how do I make them not on their own line? Because that button group class makes it a block level thing, which puts it on the line by itself. And the quick and dirty solution we used was to float them right, which is fine. So if we do that, and you don't necessarily need to do this along with me because I am gonna change it. I'm gonna do it slightly differently for a long-term solution. But what we could do is in our CSS, we could target that, which is has a class of actions. We don't want every button group necessarily to be like this, but we want that one. And say float right. That moves them over there, but you see they slam into each other. So we're not going to get into floats in a whole lot of detail, but floats take things out of the flow of the document, so they don't increase the height of their container. So now the actual LI, if we look at that, the LI is still that tall. So the button is actually taller than the LI because floats take them out. So to do that, you need to use a property called clear on the subsequent items. So the easiest way for us to do that, we'll target those flicks, which have their own class of flick on the LI. Right, the LI. Class of flick. So if we target those with CSS and add a rule, clear both, that'll just clear all the floats, and we get this. Now, the problem I have with this is that they're not centered vertically. I would like another to appear in the center of that line. I'd like everything to be lined up in the middle. And vertical alignment like that is one of the most irritatingly complicated things in all of CSS. Even when you find a solution, that solution probably doesn't work everywhere. Using line height is a good trick a lot of times. But because it's not very complicated to do in this case, I'm going to go ahead and use a slightly more modern solution that does work extremely reliably, and that is to use Flexbox, which is a completely new way of doing layout with CSS. It is reasonably well supported, but not universally supported. There are some polyfills for making that work in older browsers. Have I used the word polyfill in the morning yet? So I think that's a brand of spackling, actually. And so it's for filling in holes, basically. If you use a newer feature that isn't supported by old browsers, there may be a polyfill for that feature that you can add, which is probably just a single JavaScript file that you add to your project that then essentially transforms what you did into a version that would work in older browsers. I don't know how perfect those are for Flexbox just yet, but support is reasonably good natively for the latest versions of browsers. So I'm just going to do a very, very simple Flexbox solution for this problem. So here's I think this might be the first result actually for Flexbox and Google. A complete guide to Flexbox on CSS tricks tells you a lot. There's also what the Flexbox. Is that .com? Nope, it's .io, I think. It is not that either. What the Flexbox? Flexbox.io. Yeah, just Flexbox.io. This is from the same guy who did JavaScript 30, Wes Boss. It's a pretty good free course that gives you lots of practice doing different things that sort of illustrate all the points. Really neat way of doing layout. So we don't have to do anything terribly complicated. So first of all, what I want to do is turn each LI into its own Flexbox so that the things inside that LI I can use Flexbox rules to lay out. So for that, I just put display flex on this. So display is typically something like block or inline block or none, which you may have seen in chat. I misspoke about that. It does do what I think Dave said. That was you, right? Display none versus visibility hidden. Display none does not leave the space in the layout for that item. Visibility hidden does leave the space, but they both leave it in the DOM so you can get to it. But anyway, I want display flex. So then there's some other stuff that I can do. I'm doing this for a couple of reasons. One is just to get vertical alignment, but that's not the only benefit here. The other benefit is I want the flick name or title to take up all the space that the buttons don't. And as we add more buttons, that's going to be a different amount of space. And the easiest way to get it to do that is to use Flexbox. So that's what I'm going to do. If you look at a complete guide to Flexbox, blah, 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 you'll see some of these things you apply to the parent, to the actual Flex item, and then, or the Flex box, and then some of them you put rules on the individual items. Flex grow is something that you put on the individual items, in other words, the children of that LI, and defines the ability for a Flex item to grow if necessary, so that you can make these things all stretch out to fill the entire width of the thing. If you set them all to Flex Grow 1, then the remaining space, once they've all taken up as much as they actually need, will be distributed evenly among things. Instead, what I want to do is I want only the name to grow. I don't want the actions to grow. I want them to take up just as much space as necessary. So I'm going to, on flick name, if I just put flex grow, well, let's have a look at what it's doing right now. How wide is this thing? It is just as wide as it needs to be. And this is over here. The only reason it's all the way to the right is because I floated it. So we will be taking that out. So flex grow, let's say 1. And then we just won't put flex grow on actions. If we refresh the page and look at the span again, now the span takes up all the extra width because it's the only thing with the flex grow property on it. Now I promised vertical alignment. So there are several different alignment properties in Flexbox. Justified content, you'll see, also distributes extra free space, either at the beginning, at the end, uses the extra space to center everything, uses the extra space to put in between all the other elements, or space around. Because we did flex grow, we don't really need that. Align items defines the default behavior for how flex items are laid out along the cross axis. So with Flexbox, you can do columns or rows. It's row by default, which is why these things are beside each other instead of on top of each other. And there's a concept of the main axis and the cross axis. In this case, if I want to vertically align these things, that's the cross axis. So align items is what I need. So on flick, if I just put align items center, well, it vertically aligned this, but things aren't quite right still. You see the problem? So the name is now vertically centered, but it doesn't look like the actions are. So if this doesn't make sense to us, let's have a look at those actual buttons. So if I go over the button group, you see that orange instead of blue? So that is margin. If we look down here at the dev tools, when inspecting that particular element, I don't see margin here. Oh, there it is. Margin bottom, one rim on button group. What about the individual buttons? Looks like they might have a little bit of padding, but that's okay. Yeah, we can live with that. The button group actually overrides that anyway. So we have margin bottom of one rim. If we were to get rid of that, then they would be vertically centered. So we just need to override that. That is a rule on button group. So we're going to say, with something that has a class of both actions and button group, we have a different rule. And since that's more specific, that will take precedence. So we will say .actions .button group margin bottom 0. And that gives us just what we had. Now everything looks perfectly centered. Now, frankly, that is probably not enough space between things. So we could add a little bit of padding to the LI itself without throwing anything off. So the LI, again, is flick. So I'm going to add some padding. I will add 0.75 rim on the top and bottom and 1.25 rim on the left and right. Let's go ahead and do this. Refresh. All right, now there's a little more space. And things are lined up the way we want. May as well go ahead and add a border around these things, make it a little easier. Let's just throw border, 1 pixel, solid, a fairly light gray. Refresh. There's my border, but notice the border is too thick in between items. Did we already have this problem with anything else? Okay. So, who's got an idea for how to fix this? Yeah. Say again. Border collapse. What did you say? Is that only with tables, or can we use it? I think you can. Check out border collapse. CSS border collapse property. Maybe it is only on a table. It was certainly designed for tables. Let's see what it says here. Yeah, it's just for tables. Bummer. Anything else? So the border size we have set to 1 pixel, which is what we wanted. If I took it down to, well, I can't go any smaller than that really. Do you understand? Oh, what's up?
Are you able to just do border, like just the bottom line of the border and change that?
We could do that. The problem is then the bottom one, the very bottom one. So that brings up one possible solution. We could just make the last child have a bottom border and nothing else. That would work. What's that? To alter what?
To alter the CSS for something so little it's
No. Do flick, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And there's last child as well. Flick last child. That ought to do it. I have another way I want to show you. That totally works. What if we said only flicks that were the adjacent sibling of another flick? In other words, one that immediately follows another one. Do you remember the selector for that? So this means a flick that is the adjacent sibling of another flick. In other words, one that comes right after another one, which won't apply to the first one. So then we could say on those, there's no top border. That way we don't have to specify all but one of them in one rule. We just override one of them when we don't want it. So if one immediately follows another, we're going to set its border to 0. Refresh, and that looks the way we wanted. Cool, cool. That seems like an acceptable layout. Using Flexbox. So before I can commit, what must I do? Add. Layout. Flicks with Flexbox.